Hello, everyone. Welcome to our fourth session of our Lukács Marathon, 1001 Nights of the Totality, that we are reading and discussing each chapter of History and Class Consciousness on its 100th birthday. Hello, everyone. Sorry, I have the session of our Lukács Marathon. I have to turn the sound off, sorry. Sorry for that. Well, in the first session today, we had the essay on reification, which is probably the most known essay of History and Class Consciousness. And now we'll have perhaps two much lesser known texts, Historical Materialism's Change of Function, that will be presented by Victor Strazzeri, and Costas Gousis will present Legality and Illegality. So I'll start presenting Victor, and they will present consecutively, and we'll have the questions afterwards. So if any of you have questions, you can put it in the chat, and we will read them to the presenters, and they'll respond to the questions after both presentations. Victor Strazzeri is a postdoctoral researcher in social sciences at the Federal University of São Paulo, and an associated researcher in the Historical Institute of the University of Bern. After his undergraduate studies in Brazil, he earned his PhD in political science from the Free University of Berlin. His thesis on the young Max Weber and German social democracy was published by Brill and will be out soon in paperback from Haymarket Books. He currently coordinates the project Internationalization of the Historical Critical Dictionary of Marxism, and his latest research and publications examine the links between communist women's activism and the feminist movement in the 1970s. So let's go to Historical Materialism's Change of Function. Victor, the floor is yours.
Thanks, Mariana. Thanks so much. Thanks to HM and Paul, who's behind the scenes. I'm going to share my screen here. This time I have slides to make this a little bit less. Okay, there. All right, so this is one of the most challenging chapters of HCC to approach because in a way it gathers a lot of the tensions and paradoxes as well as the most contested passages of History and Class Consciousness, even if it's a relatively unknown chapter. The chapter was a lecture originally given in June 1919 during the Hungarian Council Revolution. And it's crucially the most heavily modified chapter of History and Class Consciousness. If you compare the 1919 version and the one in HCC, that the latter is 2/3 longer, actually. And so because of this extensive revision, the essay is a great source for the genealogy of reification critique, considering the concept was not present in the original version and it was inserted in this one. It's a great benchmark for Lukács's development overall, actually, also because of how much he changes this. But that raises the question precisely, why did he include it? If you're gonna write 2/3 extra material, why put it in the book in the first place, right? We've all had that situation with maybe a book chapter we were revising and just decide to finally write from scratch. And also because he already in 1922 says that this essay has been surpassed by the historical moment. He has this quote in the preface of 1922 that the essay echoes those exaggeratedly optimistic hopes that many of us cherished concerning the duration and tempo of the revolution. What's interesting, though, is that the modifications don't alter the past tense of capitalist exploitation, oppression, historical materialism, etc. Lukács is still writing from the standpoint of a victorious revolution. So in this quote, for instance, historical materialism was one of the proletariat's most potent weapons at a time when it was oppressed, and now it is preparing to rebuild society and culture anew. It is natural to take the method over into the new age. So the essay has very much a standpoint akin to Ernst Bloch's understanding of non-contemporaneity, I would argue. It expresses a post-revolutionary society as the past's prevented future. And I feel Lukács's inclusion of it, he wants to give us a taste of that post-revolutionary moment, so we don't forget what it feels like and what tasks that moment raises, right? So what is the change of function? And again, this is already an issue we haven't discussed, but the English translation of HCC, there's a desperate necessity for a new one. It has merits, but the title here in the English translation is Historical Materialism's Changing Function. No, it changed the function. It's in the past. The revolution is victorious. So what is the change of function? Basically, from a weapon of class struggle, it has now become the basis for a new science. And this includes an aesthetic, and this is the only chapter in History and Class Consciousness that alludes to aesthetic topics or the need for a Marxist aesthetic, which is, of course, in line with Lukács's previous and later concerns. So that's also present here. This part, the beginning of the article also includes very interesting things about the fact that the historical materialism's role in terms of something that produces scientific truth still in bourgeois society. And you could even say that some elements bring up questions that mirror Gramsci's concept of hegemony, talks about the social function of theory in political structure, in political struggle. But of course, this chapter is known for the statements Lukács makes on crisis and especially on the historicity of nature as a category. So that's what I'm going to jump to. If for all the Lukács freaks out there, I have a 20-page file where I compare both versions, and I haven't even done the end of the article. So write me and we'll sit down and look at that. But let's go to the meat of this article and where the whole controversy is at. This is maybe the most famous quote of this particular chapter. The rest of it is mostly ignored, where Lukács states that nature is a societal category. That's to say that whatever is held to be natural at any given stage of social development, however this nature is related to man and whatever form his involvement with it takes, i.e. nature's form, its contact, its range, and its objectivity are all socially conditioned. And here, I think in this passage, we have, in a nutshell, the contradictions of history and class consciousness and its reception. Because the passage is, on the one hand, a very powerful critique of naturalization, of a static view of nature, but taken too far, especially in isolation and with disregard of other caveats, can lead to blind spots in the revolutionary perspective that it raises. So above all, for consideration of gender, this is very revolutionary, right? The idea of naturalizing gender difference, you can definitely rely on this formulation of Lukács to argue that what is not natural is a shifting. It's definitely a shifting perspective over time and is a socially conditioned one. On the other hand, so it works very well for naturalization critique. The question, though, is what you do with the ecological question when you're saying that even the range of objectivity of nature, of where subjectivity ends, also shifts with a transformed perspective, with changing societal conditions. So where are the limits set by the metabolism with nature for the productive process if you have such a fluid and flexible concept of nature? But again, this is not necessarily an issue, but it's one that can arise. And here, this edition of let me stop sharing. This edition of History and Class Consciousness that came out in German has Lukács's notes to the manuscript. When he read it in the 60s, we can see what he underlined and the comments that he made. And one of the passages that he does underline is this one where he says, subjectivistic formulation, the metabolism, Stoffwechsel, is missing, right? So he's not denying the historicity of nature at all, but the notion that the objectivity of nature is fully historical makes it difficult to embed humans into extra-human nature and to theorize their exchange, their metabolism, and also how we could change it, right? So Capitalist development, Lukács writes, this is also an interesting passage from this chapter. What is then the concept of nature that is hegemonic under capitalism? Let me share the screen again. You have two concepts of nature that are hegemonic or that circulate within capitalist reality. Nature as quintessence of natural law, so nature of modern mathematical science, and nature as mood, as the model for a humanity ruined by society. And it's very important to say that Lukács refutes both, not only the mechanistic, but also the romantic view. So Lukács at no point fetishizes pre-capitalist societies. There is, in fact, a long consideration of pre-capitalist societies in the 1922 version of the essay. This is one of the big changes, and it's key to reification critique. So we kind of start understanding why he changed all of these things in the first place. Lukács states that only with capitalist socialization does economic structure subjugate all partial systems of a given society, whereas they're in pre-capitalist society, they're fragmented, they have their own legality and do not form a whole, even if that whole is not visible in or is only accidental in capitalist reality. This is something that in Giovanni's presentation in the last panel, he made very clear. So contradictorily, capitalist socialization gives the appearance of the autonomy of these different systems and units of social life, but it also makes the totality visible. And what's interesting, though, is that in referencing this issue, Lukács goes back to Engels's notion of a structural difference between societies in which private property and commodity exchange, hence the commodity form, have already emerged and where it has not. And Lukács is specifically referring to Engels relating of that historical transformation to processes of alienation. Let me switch this slide. Oh, it left, sorry. PowerPoint has been giving us trouble all day today. Here we go. There. So I don't have the quote of Engels anyway. So Lukács refers specifically to a part of, and I've been making this argument in the different sessions, that Lukács's Engels reading is strategic, is central to history and class consciousness, also is a critique of Engels for sure, but especially origin of the family, private property and the state. Lukács refers to a passage where Engels is stating that producers, having lost control of their aggregate production and the conditions of their own life, that this has also an ideological effect. Namely, Lukács highlights that Engels demonstrated how, quote, from the resultant structure of society, consciousness follows in the shape of natural laws. So he directly connects the phenomenon of alienation described by Engels to the fetishized appearances that it brings. Even though in pre-capitalist society, both commodity exchange and these fetishized forms are contingent, they don't yet make up the appearance of every societal phenomenon, as they would only in capitalism. So as a result, quoting Lukács again, the classical ideological form of the preeminence of economics becomes more intense in proportion to the degree in which social phenomena escape the control of men and become autonomous. Keep this in mind, the autonomous part, the becoming autonomous of the products of human labor. What is crucial in this insight in reference to Engels is the notion that the capitalist mode of production reproduces a specific mode of appearance of social relations. Hence, that appearance must be overcome so that the antagonistic social form itself can be transcended. And I will quote, yes, to overcome the apparent autonomy of partial systems, Lukács states, and to transcend it means, therefore, to transcend capitalist society in thought. It means anticipating its overcoming by the accelerating power of thought. This is a very interesting quote because it would seem to suggest that it is possible to overcome reification only through an operation of consciousness. But Lukács will clearly rectify this further on in the chapter. And now it's the quote that you are reading in the screen. Quote, thus we see that the road to an understanding of pre-capitalist societies with a non-reified structure could not be opened up until historical materialism had perceived that the reification of all man's social relations is both a product of capitalism and hence also an ephemeral historical phenomenon. For only now, with the prospect of reestablishing non-reified relations between man and between man and nature, could those factors in primitive pre-capitalist formations be discovered in which these non-reified forms were present, albeit in the service of quite different functions. So here, very clearly, Lukács restates that overcoming reification is only possible concretely. This is something that Konstantin alluded to yesterday in his praise of Andrew Feenberg's work on philosophy of praxis. So Lukács refers to this necessarily concrete overcoming of reification, referencing how vulgar Marxists overlook the fact that, and here Lukács will quote Marx, capitalist production as a continuous connected process, as a process of reproduction, produces not only commodities, not only surplus value, it also produces and reproduces the capitalist relation. On the one side, the capitalist, on the other, the wage laborer. So here's Lukács quoting Marx. And here, the overcoming of reification assumes a clearly practical political character. Quote, hence, let me see if I have that quote for you. No. Hence, a change in the course of social development is only possible if it prevents the self-reproduction of the capitalist relation and gives the self-reproduction of society a new direction. End of quote. This is a quote later in the chapter. So if you cannot overcome reification in the realm of consciousness alone, reification is, however, a central part of the mechanism that reproduces the capital relation. In other words, you must overcome it as part of the concrete process of destroying the current antagonistic societal form and establishing a new one. But reification cannot crucially be transcended outside of this process. Here, however, we come to an inherent tension in this essay, a contradiction even, which is the ultra-leftist political translation of the reification critique. This is best visible when Lukács attempts to characterize just how we overcome reification in capitalism, what that entails. Here is where certain questions of theory, some of which appeared in the previous session, session 3, spell out their political consequences. And this quote here, the first you see on the screen, makes it clear. The organization of the revolutionary elements as a class, not merely as against capital, but also for itself, the conversion of mere productive power into a lever of social change, is not just a problem of class consciousness and the practical efficacy of conscious action. At the same time, it signals the beginning of the end of the natural laws of economism. So we don't have just not just an issue of the subjective factor and its political form is at play here, but also of a new relationship to reality. So Lukács then goes into his notorious consideration on the nature of crisis under capitalism. It is less known that this point is also something that the elder Lukács radically disagrees with his younger self. So for starters, in its positive aspects, we see Lukács's debt to Luxembourg very clearly in how he understands crisis. Capitalism is not a homogeneous structure in terms of a mode of production that is free from pre-capitalist social relations, to Lukács. Quote, capitalism was never one and can never be one, according to Rosa Luxemburg. This is Lukács speaking about Luxembourg. There are always, Lukács states, predominant and subordinate systems of production. But he draws perhaps a problematic conclusion, because their rivalry, he states, is expressed as the insoluble contradiction within the capitalism itself, namely as crisis. And a general crisis always signifies a point of relative suspension of the imminent laws of capitalist evolution. This idea that capitalism suspends the laws of the capitalist political economy is something that the elder Lukács will underline in his book and say false. Crisis in the unity of the capitalist production, correct only emphasis on the violent fact of the exit of the crisis. Let's see here. So, just so you don't look at the slide the whole time. So the fact that there's this moment of undecidedness is translated politically by Lukács with the question of whether the greatest productive power of the capitalist production system, namely the proletariat, experiences the crisis as object or subject of the decision. Previously, with the passivity of the proletariat, the capitalist class was able to break the deadlock and to get the machine going again. But in the final crisis, the proletariat ceases to be the mere object of the crisis. It now leaves the stage of negativity, in which its effects were merely to impede, weaken, or restrain, and it proceeds to a stage of activity. It's no coincidence that this kind of decisionist point of view on the proletariat taking advantage of the moment of crisis evokes the question of how a revolutionary working class, which transcends capitalist reality and its reified forms, relates to reality in general. And this was brought up in the previous session with Mariana's reference to the elder Lukács's critique of history and class consciousness conflating alienation and objectification. So to go into the passages that most clearly give rise to this form of criticism, including by Lukács himself. Let me go to the presentation again. Here we go. I think this is the passage where this contradiction, this possible reading is at its clearest. Okay, so Lukács states that the social meaning of the dictatorship of the proletariat, socialization, means in the first instance no more than that this command, the command of capital over labor and the products of labor, will be taken out of the hands of the capitalists. As a result, for the proletariat, regarded as a class, the confrontation with its own objectified labor, turned autonomous, is objectively overcome. End of quote. So the revolution then for Lukács means fundamentally an overcoming of a condition of alienation that is not exclusive to capitalism, but is only universalized to encompass all social relations, and hence manifests itself in reified forms of consciousness in this mode of production. In terms of the debates on the reception of history and class consciousness, this is a key passage. In the 67 preface, of course, Lukács will say here is precisely where he equated objectification, so the materialization of praxis, with alienation. And hence, if the latter is overcome, this is what's suggested, so is objectification itself. And if we read the passage, we can both understand why the elder Lukács made this criticism, but also where you perhaps could relativize it. The key is the complement turned autonomous. The revolution signals that, quote, for the proletariat regarded as class, the confrontation with its own objectified labor turned autonomous is objectively overcome. Hence, not the confrontation with objective labor as such, but again, with as I mentioned in the last session, with all these debates with the reception, we will not solve them through exegesis alone. These forms of reading are rooted in the tensions within the text itself. The question then are, what are the practical political consequences of these forms of reading? And here, again, to go more in the direction that indeed there is a conflation of alienation and objectification, we have the second part of the quote, in which Lukács says, through the fact that the proletariat takes command simultaneously over both labor, which has already been objectified, and labor in actual effect, this opposition is practically and objectively overcome. And I think here, Lukács means the opposition between dead and living labor as formulated by Marx in Capital. So that labor is that which is embodied in the means and objects of production, and in capital itself as this vampire-like entity that lives off feeding, that feeds off living labor. So going back to Lukács, with this opposition, he says, this appears also the corresponding opposition in capitalist society of past and present. However the objective process of socialization may be, however long it takes the proletariat to become conscious of the changed inner relationship of labor to its objectified forms, with the dictatorship of the proletariat, the decisive turn has been taken. So put differently, the liberation of commodified labor through the wielding of its own productive power leads to the destruction of the capitalist economic structure and its reified manifestations. And here again, we have a series of passages, and I'm running out of time, so I'll be very brief, where Lukács not only speaks of transcending capitalist reality as transcending a certain objectivity, but he also refers to the overcoming of necessity itself as part of the economic process and the economy itself. So I'll read just this one more quote. For the first time, mankind consciously takes its history into its own hands, thanks to the class consciousness of a proletariat summoned to power. This does not negate the necessity of the objective economic process, but it does confer on it another new function. If, hiato, the task was to deduce from the objective course of history what was going to come anyway in order to turn it to the advantage of the proletariat, if necessity was still, until then, the positive guiding element in the process, it now becomes an impediment which has to be fought. Step by step, it's pushed back in the process of transformation until after long, arduous struggles, it can be totally eliminated. And here the elder Lukács writes, mechanistic, ultra-left formulation. So the question that for us as readers is more, I think, in the passage, he both says this does not negate the necessity of the objective economic process, the revolution, does not negate this necessity in itself, but in the end, he says it's totally eliminated. So this tension, I think, is undeniable. So that's why my answer to Mariana with regards to whether he indeed conflates alienation and objectification was that while both readings are possible, it's hard to argue just for one and say the other one is not a possible reading. But where we stand and how we position ourselves to the text is, of course, another question. And so, let me just to conclude, I'll stop to parcel out these tensions in this chapter in history and class consciousness itself is hardly possible. There's no exegetical solution to them. Many of these passages can be read in opposing ways, in fact. And so what we can do is reflect on the consequences of these readings, as I mentioned before. But in line with the idea of the marathon, the place of this essay in HCC, the choice to include it by Lukács, also provides answers. Change of function comes after reification and before legality and illegality. The second essay on Rosa Luxemburg and the chapter on organization, of course. So the structure of HCC as can be read in a way as going from theory to praxis. The first two chapters, Orthodox Marxism and Rosa Luxemburg as Marxist, with a clear theoretical emphasis, and the last three with a clearly practical one. This leaves the middle ones as the mediation, right? But they also form a dynamic unity. If the class consciousness essay stresses the objective grounding of the standpoint of the proletariat and reification, the tension between constraining mediations and the self-activity necessary to overcome them, change of function stresses the subjective factor in revolution, thought and class. So if you read them in isolation, which of course you can, the tendency is to overstress one of these elements or individual passages, where the truth of HCC is not only in the whole, in the structure of the work as a self-contained publication, but also in its internal tensions. Understanding the latter, however, and this is my concluding thought, presupposes another reading of the standpoint of totality, one that encompasses Lukács's development as embedded in a concrete situation of the early 20s, and in a Central Europe and a world that the Russian Revolution has changed for good, just not in the sense of the exaggeratedly optimistic hopes that were tied to the Russian Revolution. So already in 22, as I said, Lukács spoke of those optimistic hopes that many of us cherished concerning the duration and the tempo of the revolution. That was 1922. Well, in 2023, the duration and the tempo seem hopelessly long and very much non-linear, but the final part of HCC, the practice-centered chapters, might well hold the keys to get back to that optimism without any illusions. But I'll let Costas and the upcoming speakers tell you more about that. Thanks so much for listening.
Many thanks, Victor, for your presentation on this very peculiar chapter. It's about a future that never was yet. And I didn't know that my question was going to be so meticulously answered in your presentation. That's very nice. So I'll pass on to Costas. Before that, just let me remember that you can also already pose your questions to Victor in the chat, and we'll read the questions in the end. So Costas is a lawyer and a political scientist with a PhD on migrant activism. He's currently a postdoctoral researcher at Pantheon University in Athens, working on a research project called Democrisis. I love this title. Please, Costas, and he's going to talk about legality and illegality.
Thank you very much, Mariana. So, following on from Victor, I will draw your attention to Lukács' essay, Legality and Illegality. It was written in July 1920 for the Vienna journal Kommunismus. And I would like to begin with some biographical details about Lukács during the time that he was writing this article. Lukács was living in Vienna as a political exile and was a member of the Central Committee of the illegal Hungarian Communist Party. Under the short-lived Hungarian Republic of Councils in 1919, it lasted only 133 days, Lukács served as People's Commissar for Education and later as the political representative of the 5th Division of the Hungarian Red Army. After the defeat of the Republic, he went underground in Budapest, trying to reorganize the party under the new circumstances. And after his comrade Otto Corvin was arrested and executed by the counter-revolutionary forces, Lukács emigrated to Vienna. George Steiner once said that Lukács lived the 20th century like few people on the planet, bearing witness to the 20th century, being what the Greek word martyras originally means, which does not mean martyr, but witness. In his article, Spider and Fly, the Leninist philosophy of Georg Lukács, you can find it at the Historical Materialism Journal, volume 21 in 2013. By the way, subscribe and support Historical Materialism Journal. It's vital. So Paul Leblanc in this article provides some interesting details of Lukács' activities as a revolutionary exile in Vienna in the early 20s. It is important again to carefully consider the context. Lukács had no hesitation in risking arrest to travel from Vienna to Budapest during Horthy dictatorship for weekly clandestine meetings with leading communist workers in Budapest, where Lukács tried to lead study groups to discuss with the workers the tactics and methods of working within the trade unions and oversee the party's semi-legal press. He was working closely with the leader of the Railway Workers' Union, Landler, and led together a faction opposing an ultra-left sectarian orientation represented by Bela Kun in the Hungarian Communist Party. As Paul Leblanc concludes, and this is a quote, Lukács of the 20s was absolutely clear that there can be no revolutionary Marxism detached from the actual lives, consciousness, and struggles of the working class, end of quote. So Lukács is writing on legality and illegality while being in the leadership of an illegal communist party. And I think that this is something important. In this presentation, I will examine the role of this essay, situating it first in the universe of the articles that Lukács wrote during 1920 in the journal Kommunismus, and secondly, in the political universe of history and class consciousness. My main argument is that this essay represents an important step on Lukács' contradictory road to Leninism, or as Michel Levy described it in the title of his book in 1979, Lukács' road from Romanticism to Leninism. Before I proceed with this contradictory road, please let me refer to a more general comment on the contradictions of Lukács' work throughout his life. Thanasis Vakalios, a Greek anti-fascist resistance fighter in World War II, a political refugee in Budapest and a student of Lukács, has highlighted the fact that in the work of Lukács, the contradictory trajectories of the communist movement and socialism found their theoretical expression, including major ideological issues and debates, anxieties and expectations, a genuine Marxist trajectory and contribution, symptomatic of the way and the degree that Lukács interpreted and practiced Marxism as philosophy of praxis. To build my argument that this essay on legality and illegality is an important step towards Leninism, I would like to draw your attention to the fact that Lukács wrote this article 1 month after Lenin issued his pamphlet, Left-Wing Communism and Infantile Disorder. In this pamphlet, Lenin aimed to speak about the main lessons that the Bolshevik Party had learned from its involvement in 3 revolutions in 12 years, the third one victorious, Socialist Revolution in 1917 in October. And Lenin tried to speak about this experience in a manner that European communists could relate to, for it was to them he was speaking. Lenin gave personal attention to the book's printing schedule so that it would be published in German, English, and French before the opening of the Second Congress of the Communist International, each delegate receiving a copy. Lukács was not a delegate in the Second Congress of the Third International, though he was a delegate in was not a delegate in the Second Congress, but he was a delegate in the Third Congress. But we know that he read Lenin's pamphlet immediately after it was published. And as he puts it in his 1967 preface, he immediately saw Lenin's pamphlet to be correct, and it was the beginning of a change in his views. In this respect, I totally agree with Michel Levy, who argues that this change first became apparent in the essay Legality and Illegality, the one we're discussing. However, not everybody agrees with this point. For instance, in his work, Georg Lukács' Marxism, Alienation, Dialectics, Revolution, A Study in Utopia, written when Lukács was still alive in 1964, a political scientist, Victor Zita, sees legality and illegality in the opposite way. As he stresses, Lukács retaliated with this article, which is partly a counterattack against his critiques, mainly Lenin, and partly an apology of his position. In my view, this is a wrong way to read the essay, because it is neither an apology of his position nor a counterattack against Lenin. Let's follow the sequence of the events. In March 1920, Lukács wrote in Kommunismus an article on parliamentarism, where he took a stand against the participation of the communists in parliament in principle. This position was actually similar at the time to Béla Kun's theory of an active boycott of the parliament. Lenin wrote a response to Béla Kun in the journal Kommunismus, where he also criticizes Lukács, quoting Lenin. Georg Lukács' article is very left-wing and very poor. Its Marxism is purely verbal. Its distinction between defensive and offensive tactics is artificial. It gives no concrete analysis of precise and definite historical situations. It takes no account of what is most essential, the need to take over and to learn to take over all fields of work and all institutions in which the bourgeoisie exerts its influence over the masses. End of quote. In one of his final interviews in the Hungarian television in 1969, Lukács stressed that this opinion of Lenin was very instructive for him. In my reading of Legality and Illegality, I would argue that it is crucial to understand this context, the fact that Lukács took seriously Lenin's critique, both directly at his work and indirectly at what Lenin criticized as ultra-leftism. So, the main argument of Lenin's pamphlet, Left-Wing Communism and Infantile Disorder, is that the primary danger for the working class movement in general is opportunism on the one hand and anti-Marxist ultra-leftism on the other. Likewise, in the essay Legality and Illegality, Lukács is criticizing both the cretinism of legality and the romanticism of illegality. Lukács explains that the opportunists persist in acting legally at any price and criticizes their fatal illusion about the peaceful transition to socialism. According to Lukács, the great distinction between revolutionary Marxists and pseudo-Marxist opportunists consists in the fact that for the former, the revolutionary Marxists, the capitalist state counts merely as a power factor against which the power of the organized proletariat is to be mobilized, whilst the latter, the pseudo-Marxists, regard the state as an institution standing above the classes and the proletariat, and the proletariat and the bourgeoisie conduct their war in order to gain control of it. Lukács is explicit at this point, quoting Lukács, but by viewing the state as an object of the struggle rather than as the enemy, they, the pseudo-Marxists, have mentally gone over to bourgeois territory and thereby lost half the battle even before taking up arms. End of quote. And what about the other danger? Lukács equally criticizes the reaction against legality at any price, which he calls the romanticism of illegality, and describes it as an infantile disorder of the communist movement, which is a direct relation to Lenin's pamphlet as well. Of course, Lenin's echoes are here strong and clear. For Lukács, the hypostasization of illegality suggests that the law has preserved its authority, admittedly in an inverted form, that it is still in a position inwardly to influence one's actions, meaning with that a genuine inner emancipation has not yet occurred. So, if we regret both the cretinism of legality and the romanticism of illegality, what remains? The following rather long passage is the most indicative of Lukács's refined position. The question of legality or illegality reduces itself for the Communist Party to a mere question of tactics, even to a question to be resolved on the spur of the moment, one for which it is scarcely possible to lay down general rules, as decisions have to be taken on the basis of immediate expediencies. In this wholly unprincipled solution lies the only possible practical and principled rejection of the bourgeois legal system. Such tactics are essential for communists, and not just on grounds of expediency. They are needed not just because it is only in this way that their tactics will acquire a genuine flexibility and adaptability to the exigencies of the particular moment, nor because the alternate or even the simultaneous use of legal and illegal methods is necessary if the bourgeoisie is to be fought effectively. Such tactics are necessary in order to complete the revolutionary self-education of the proletariat. End of quote. It is quite striking the fact that the words education and the word knowledge, each one of them appears 10 times in this short essay on legality and illegality. And it is no coincidence that the essay begins with thesis 3 for a Marxist thesis on Feuerbach, explaining the dialectical relationship between circumstances and education, famously stating that the educator must also be educated. The way Lukács builds his argument in this essay is very much related to reification and the discussion we had in previous sessions. And it is related more explicitly to what Frederick Jameson calls the epistemological privilege, the conditions of possibility of new thinking inherent in this particular class position, the capacity to think in terms of process as contrasted to reification, which Frederick Jameson sees as blocks and limits to knowledge, as what suppresses the ability to grasp totalities. And at this point, I would like to quote 3 specific passages that shed light on this pedagogical aspect of this essay, on how education and knowledge are the building blocks of Lukács' argument. First, these are 3 quotes, 3 passages from the essay. First, Marxist theory is designed to put the proletariat into a very particular frame of mind. The capitalist state must appear to it as a link in a chain of historical development. Hence, it by no means constitutes man's natural environment, but merely a real fact, whose actual power must be reckoned with, but which has no inherent right to determine our actions. The state and the laws shall be seen as having no more than an empirical validity. The second one is, I think, my favorite. In the same way, a yachtsman or a yachtswoman must take exact note of the direction of the wind without letting the wind determine their course. On the contrary, they defy and exploit the wind in order to hold fast to their original course. And the third one, the strength of every society is in the last resort a spiritual strength. And from this, we can only be liberated by knowledge. This knowledge cannot be of the abstract kind that remains in one's head. Many socialists have possessed that sort of knowledge. So it's, I repeat it, the knowledge cannot be of the abstract kind that remains in one's head. It must be knowledge that has become flesh of one's flesh and blood of one's blood. To use Marx's phrase, it must be practical, critical activity. After all, we should not forget that Lukács sees, as we learn in the last chapter of History and Class Consciousness, sees the Communist Party as one of the most important intellectual questions of the revolution. So, I would like to finish my talk with the following rather metaphysical question. How would our history and class consciousness marathon appear in Lukács' eyes? We have a hint from Lukács' creative engagements with the broader 1968 radicalism. After Rudi Dutschke and other student activists visited Lukács in his apartment in Budapest in the spring of 1966, Dutschke noted in his diary, quoting Dutschke, "I asked him, Lukács, about debates inside the Hungarian Communist Party during the 1920s, and he was astonished that a young socialist from West Berlin was crazy about details of the Communist Party history. He was not so satisfied with that and was eager to discuss with us about more recent issues rather than the period of 1920s. End of quote. Lukács didn't live to see the neoliberal counterattack of the 80s, the neoliberal counter-reform, the collapse of Soviet Union, the triumphalist declaration of the end of history during the 90s, the outbreak of wars, the capitalist crisis of 2008, the return of fascist threat, and the enormous confusion on the meaning of socialism itself, not to mention the degeneration of most communist parties in the world. In an interview that he gave during 1968 and was published at Lukács' request after his death in the Australian Left Review, Bernie Daft said at the end, "Comrade Lukács, you seem rather pessimistic." And Lukács replied, "No, I am optimistic for the 21st century." Of course, Lukács was never naive and had a deep understanding of the fact that solutions, if left to develop along capitalist lines, quoting Lukács again, would lead over a long period of crisis, civil wars, and imperialist world wars on an ever-increasing scale to the mutual destruction of the opposing classes, to a new barbarism. In this sense, because this description could actually be applied to the situation in the world we're living in, Lukács might have understood why 100 years, I hope that also in 200 years after History and Class Consciousness is published, it is still discussed and it is still inspiring for militants around the world. However, what we're doing right now, to refer to it, I think that Lukács might have understood why a group of comrades from Brazil, Croatia, Germany, Greece, Hungary, Italy, and the Netherlands are crazy enough to come up with the idea of a Lukács marathon. Of course, we know that history and class consciousness will not give us recipes for the cookshops of the future, to borrow a famous phrase. But I think that the whole book provides us with some guiding principles and a breathing space. It is a constant reminder that there is always an alternative. And especially the essay on legality and illegality, which is a bit more directly related to political tactics, I think that it's like a message to the body. And the whole discussion that we're bringing up in our marathon, sometimes I feel it is a life jacket, considering the amateurish politics of the left that often leaves militants with a state of moodiness, turning from short-lived enthusiasm to a constant feeling of despair. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Costas. That was a very inspiring talk, a little bit of hope in these times. And I think it's also very interesting how you dropped a lot of biographical information as well in your presentation, connecting it to the topic of the text, and also thematized our marathon and the fact that we are reading this text still today and discussing it. So I think it's important to start to reflect also on our position in all of this. So we have for now one question for each of you. The first one is from me to Victor. And so I wrote that I agree that history and class consciousness is filled with tensions, most of the time, I think productive tensions, and that there's no clear, definite answer to whether he conflates or not reification and objectification. I think that's, and that we should focus on the political implications of one or and the other alternatives. And I understand that as you, we shouldn't perhaps fall too easily in the young versus old Lukács too easily, and understand that both are more complex than it's normally characterized from the opposite side. But my impression is that Lukács himself does that when he considers his own early work to be simply conflating these categories. So I want to understand, why do you think he had this blatant position about his early work, not recognizing the tensions that were there? And this is connected to your proposal, which I think is very interesting, to try to understand the political consequences of whether he did or not conflate these two categories. So what are what do you think are the political consequences of each side, and why did he choose to condemn so blatantly his early work in this specific sense?
Thanks, Mariana. Yeah, these are really difficult questions, and I don't want it to seem when I refer to tensions that I'm trying to somehow escape from giving a clear answer to them, but I'll try to draw out some of the consequences and say, but to be very succinct, I think the answer is not so much, yeah, maybe he's too unilateral with regards to his own earlier work. But there are things where it's clear he has changed position. He feels the lack of the dialectics of nature is a major missing component, and that's a fact. We can then disagree whether that is a problem or not. But he makes a clear statement, which is based on the work. The question of alienation and objectification has a little bit more, is a little bit more ambiguous, because like I said, the question with that passage was, is the thing that you overcome an objectivity, so the products of labor that became autonomous and hence alienated, or with that autonomous character, you overcome that objectivity entirely? And then what is replacing it, actually? Is it a new relation to reality where subject and object no longer, they enter into a new relationship? It's very interesting how these issues reflect in the ecological debate nowadays, where we're trying to overcome a dualistic view of humanity and nature, right? Because if you posit them as two parts of a binary, you already misunderstand the stakes in ecological conservation, in transforming the mode of production to an ecological one. On the other hand, if you just say that a monist position where you overcome that difference by fusing subject and object, or in this case, humanity and nature, makes the question of praxis very difficult as well. So if the subject and object are fused, what are the mediations that are necessary so that there is a transformation of this object or of the subject itself? I mean, these are exactly the issues that the ecological movement is coming in, that it at times falls into the dualism again, and in other times the unity becomes this kind of mystical whole and praxis disappears. And especially the subject of the transformation disappears if our emphasis is in the fact that the subject is also nature and hence transform nature, but also themselves. This is just an example of how today we're dealing with the same issues. And I'm not sure that's why in the case of the ecological debate, this is factionalized as in the monistic versus the dualistic perspective. And that doesn't really help, I think, unless we translate that into a concrete political program. In the case of, to go back to Lukács himself, the answer is not so much, was he unfair with himself? Where we see where he was more differentiated, where he takes elements from history and class consciousness and further develops them, is in his later writings, but not only in the ontology. We should not put these two works in this opposition. In the young Hegel, he will, especially in the introduction, recover elements of the critique of reification, but he's clearly not satisfied. He wants to go beyond it as a critique of alienation. Or for instance, there is a critique of bureaucracy in history and class consciousness, but it's very much derived from Max Weber. He, in many ways, derives, so bureaucracy is just the reproduction of fetishized forms of productive life in the state or in administration, right? So he shows that there's an analogy between these structures. I think the later Lukács is not satisfied with just drawing analogies between a phenomenon at the level of economic life and in other social spheres. He wants a more concrete analysis. So he has a text called Volkstribun oder Bürokrat, People's Tribune or Bureaucrat, where through aesthetics, he's going to try and conceptualize bureaucracy in a much more concrete way, without having to say this is just an expression of, alienated forms in economic life. And I could go on and on. In an essay he wrote about Goethe's Wilhelm Meister apprenticeship years, to go back to something that Costas said, he talks about the limits of a subjectivist position to reality, and how the whole premise of the book is to demonstrate that education, effective pedagogy or education, is educating towards a practical relationship to reality, not a subjectivist opposition to it. So to talk about the limits of each position, I think, again, I talked about the difference between Gramsci and Giovanni Gentili. You can, a practice-centered view can, if it's taken to a certain limit, result in a fascist position, a position that has action and a total transformation of reality as its program. Is not necessarily revolutionary in an emancipatory sense. There's a passage from Marie Lefebvre's Critique of Everyday Life where he also makes this point. not every theory that posits the ability to absolutely transform realities does so in an emancipatory sense. And especially a concept of praxis that is, or a concept of revolutionary movement that is, or Marxism that is too focused on the ability of praxis to transform the world, tends to devolve, to fall into a kind of a messianical conception of the revolution, where you're expecting to transform everything at once. And so the revolutionary subject comes to redeem humanity in many ways. All of these, sometimes this is it's necessary to have these positions. I think the question with HCC is not only how to read it correctly, but that sometimes it's just the book that we need to read, also because of its limits. And this is one of them. It's the book that pushes us towards practice and towards overcoming binaries and the dualisms that freeze us into this contemplative position. But again, I just hesitate to see it as the end all and be all of Marxist theory, especially in light of all the attempts of Lukács to refine the theses that are in it. So where Lukács is not unilateral about his work is in his later writings, and not just the ontology, everything that's in between. In his aesthetic writings, he's always searching for more concrete ways to situate ethical questions, which are at the center of history and class consciousness. And just to finish, I'll advertise a little bit the dossier that we're editing, where we have a bunch of essays relating history and class consciousness to the aesthetic, to the destruction of reason, and to the ontology, where we see the echoes of a reading that is much more faithful and fair of his own work in his later writings. So thank you. That was a bit long.
Thanks, Victor. Now I'm going to read Konstantin's question to Costas. He says the following: do you see a proximity between Lukács' concept of the state in legality and illegality as not merely a neutral object of the struggle, but an enemy, and Gramsci's conception of the relation between civil society and the state?
Thank you very much, Konstantin, for this question. Well, I should first state that, of course, we can see Lukács' concept of the state, and the way that Konstantin defines it as not merely a neutral object of the struggle, but an enemy is correct. But I should also say that this is a short essay, and Lukács does not really expand on his concept of the state. He's mostly politically concerned to defend his own position and criticize the cretinism of legality and the romanticism of illegality. So at this point, we could say that Gramsci's conception of the relation between civil society and the state is a more complex one. It's part of it's an important part of Gramsci's theoretical contribution. I don't know if they're in the same direction. There is a proximity, but I don't know if we can really use this essay in order to compare a short essay in a journal with Gramsci's whole theoretical contribution to this issue. But we can see a proximity at a different level, because Gramsci was also very much politically concerned with the issues of legality and illegality during the 20s in the Communist Party. And there is a fantastic text from 1925 about for an ideological preparation of the masses. It is Gramsci's introduction to the first course of the party school, in 1925, and Gramsci signed it as the propaganda section of the Communist Party, where he speaks about all this experience of semi-legality and illegality that the revolutionary movement and the Communist Party experienced in Italy during the early 20s, where the freedom of the press, where the right to assemble, to organize, to agitate have been suppressed, and where most Communist Party, many Communist Party members and cadres were persecuted. So he was speaking there about the dangers of many new members of the Communist Party experienced the party only in a situation of semi-legality and illegality. And Gramsci discusses the dangers of experiencing this kind of situation and drawing the wrong conclusions from it at a more general methodological level. So I see a proximity between this text by Gramsci and Lukács's essay, because it is we can also compare the two political situations, different but comparable. The second, should I continue, or we should keep it short? And okay, the second thing is that Lukács, there is also a post-revolutionary moment, in order to borrow my dear friend's Victor phrase that said about this post-revolutionary moment in the chapter about the change of action of historical materialism. In the essay on legality and illegality, there is also a post-revolutionary moment where Lukács speaks about the dangers of Communist Party members and leaders who were trained in a situation of prolonged illegality, and after the victory of the revolution, they cannot easily adapt to the new situation that the Communist Party expresses a new kind of situation in the post-revolutionary period, where the understanding of legality and illegality should also change its function, and being either reproducing the cretinism of legality or the romanticism of illegality might be even more dangerous politically in the post-revolutionary period. So generally, there is a big discussion about proximities between Gramsci and Lukács. I'm a huge fan of reading Gramsci and Lukács together. There are many points we cannot discuss here, but I would just like to refer to, in order to end this comment, to refer to Peter Thomas's Gramscian moment, a fantastic work on Gramsci. Hopefully and fortunately soon it will be also published in Greek. And in this book, Peter Thomas says that Lukács seems to be giving, to focus more on the decisive moment, this conception of politics as Augenblick, and Gramsci to the process. That could be, I don't really agree, but that could be the starting point of a very creative dialogue about Lukács and Gramsci and their work at the time. Thank you.
Thanks, Costas. So we have around 5 minutes, and we don't have more questions in the chat right now, but I would like to perhaps use my privileged position as chair to take up a little bit the discussion with Victor, and also ask a clarification question to Costas. Victor, I don't know if maybe I phrased it weirdly. I didn't mean that the older Lukács is unidimensional, but that he treats his early work as unidimensional, just to make that clear. And I guess I'm always come back to this point because it strikes me as very, very strange to think that someone would advocate for the end of objectivity, überhaupt, toute court. So I don't think even Hegel does that. I mean, nature is overcoming history, but in a sense, nature is also still there. And I'm not going to go into Hegel, but I think you must be very. It's a very strong accusation to say that someone will say that objectivity itself will cease to exist. So that's why I'm always. I can understand a lot of his criticisms, but that one always strikes me a little bit as, I don't know, I find it weird because the history and class consciousness talks so much about how all of this is only possible in capitalism. So to say that he's talking that reification is an ahistorical concept, it's difficult for me to understand. Maybe you can, if you want to react to that, I'll just ask Costas my question, and then I'll give the word to both of you. Costas, I think it was, I really loved how you mentioned the presence of education and knowledge in the essay. And I don't know if it was in this moment that you mentioned this beautiful image of the wind as something that you have to learn to deal with, exactly, precisely to do the contrary of sometimes, to do the contrary of what it is doing, to keep in your path. But I think I missed the beginning. I don't know. Can you clarify what the wind is an allegory for in the argument that you were posing? It's just a clarification question because I think it was a very nice image, and I'd like to understand more. So, Victor, if you want to say something.
Yeah, thank you so much for and of course, you're absolutely right. I wouldn't even argue, I would say that history and class consciousness suggests that there can be a total surpassing of objectivity, where I think that the questions are, again, you're totally right. The questions are more what happens when the categories that are polarizing the discussion are revolutionary praxis on one side, let's say the positive, and reification as the negativity. Because even if and the merit of the work is exactly showing how you overcome this negativity and why it's necessary to do so and why it exists. Once you come into that post-revolutionary situation Costas was talking about, even if you manage to, with this concept of praxis, you end up with a kind of disembedded praxis, I think. There's not enough in the work for us to more concretely understand the tasks of building this new alternative or this new reality. And in a way, of course, there's no recipe for this post-revolutionary situation. But I think what Lukács is aware is that we need more mediations even to arrive at that situation. So my example would be, it's just a shift of emphasis in his work from the praxis against the reification, which you dissolve and you come into this new situation, to, for instance, labor, which more strongly raises the question of, it's funny, we went into this question of who is the working class. Lukács will, in locating labor as the fundamental category of all social praxis, there's an analogy to Gramsci who's saying every person is a philosopher, right? He's also seeking in labor the basic unity or the basic unit of every other social process. Hence, he's making it less of an elitist. He's giving less conditions so that you can reach a disalienated position. He's looking for pathways to a different relationship to the world in a more fundamental situation or operation, which non-coincidentally has the mediation with nature embedded into how it operates. So it's very easy to derive from history and class consciousness this idea that, to overcome all these fetishized forms you need a very sophisticated form of philosophy or to be the most advanced Marxist possible or a certain situation. And if you go back, however, to labor as the basis or as the unit of our relationship to reality, you can find ways of emancipatory or non-alienated forms of interacting with nature, or socially, that are giving in other forms, also in pre-capitalist forms, and you can, latch onto them for the revolutionary process, I guess. So it's more a shift of emphasis and a shift of, and with that, what mediations are elicited, I guess. So he goes back to the labor in terms of the very thing that is central to the humanization process is where we should look for the basis for an emancipatory philosophy or view on life. I don't think this contradicts the effort of the critical effort of history and class consciousness, but it just brings another angle. Everyday life comes in much more centrally. So his later work is just searching for more mediations to the perspective that he raised in his early one, which doesn't mean that there are no issues and contradictions with the later work as well. But I don't know if that helps in any way. But again, thanks for your question.
Yeah, that was very good. Thank you, Victor. Costas?
Well, yes, thank you, Mariana. I will clarify the point that you mentioned. Please allow me because I forgot, that was the most important thing that I wanted to comment on Konstantin's question, and I forgot it because I got enthusiastic to talk about other things. What Konstantin says about this proximity is very, very important for a specific reason, because Eurocommunism and many readings of Gramsci during the 70s onwards till today try to construct an image of Gramsci that his concept of state is actually the state as a neutral object of the struggle. So it's very important to stress the fact that a reading of Gramsci that understands that part of main part of his theoretical argument, the heart of his theoretical argument, is that the state is an enemy. No matter if his analysis is complex, no matter the whole conception of hegemony tries to understand that we need a refined position to understand how to have to elaborate revolutionary tactics in Western Europe and in somewhat more stable bourgeois democracies. But at the end of the day, there is this kind of proximity that rescues Gramsci from opportunistic readings of seemingly followers of Gramsci the decades that after, especially the 60s and 70s, etc. So that is important. And another comment about probably the session discussing the last chapter of History and Class Consciousness, I think Dimitra is presenting on it on Thursday, has to do with a quote that I also used, that after all, the Communist Party is the most important intellectual question of the revolution. This concept of political intellectuality, and I would like to suggest Panagiotis Sotiris' article about modern Prince as laboratory of political intellectuality, where he draws parallels between Gramsci and Lukács in a very creative way. So now I would come back to your question. This phrase about the wind and the yachtsman comes just after Lukács' position that the state and the laws shall be seen as having no more than an empirical validity. And there he gives the example in order to make his point clear. And he says that in the same way that a yachtsman must take exact note of the direction of the wind without letting the wind determine his course. On this same way, we should understand that what he does is, on the contrary, he defies and exploits the wind in order to hold fast to his original course. And the next phrase is also very interesting. I didn't mention it. The independence which man in the course of a long historical development has gradually wrested from the hostile forces of nature is still very largely lacking in the proletariat when it confronts the manifestations of society. I think it's an interesting way that Lukács uses an example from nature without reproducing the tendency to understand this example in a mechanic way in order to, transfer what is happening with the wind and what should happen with the political tactics of the party. He does it in a very creative and productive way in order to make his point clear.
That's great. Thank you, Costas, for your clarification. Well, I guess we are ready on time. Yeah, you guys want to say some last words, or are you okay? You're fine, okay. So I'll close this session. It's late in Greece. I guess we should be finishing already, indeed. Thank you much. Thank you both so much for the presentations. Both talks were very, very nice and about texts that are not so often discussed. So I think that was one of the reasons we wanted to do this marathon in this format. So thank you both for the presentations. Thank you for the audience. And we'll be back on Thursday with the last two sessions. The first session will discuss observations on Rosa Luxemburg's critique of of Russian Revolution with Anita Tsursan, and Dimitra Aliferaki will talk about towards the methodology of the problem of organization. And the second session of the day, which is the last session of our marathon, we'll have Konstantin Behrens again, now discussing the 1967 preface. And then we'll have all the participants present for for the last moment. So we'll discuss further questions that have arisen in the meantime. You can send us questions via email or write them in the chat. We'll have a look before the session, and we'll take up some of the topics that were raised during the whole of the conference, the marathon. So thank you so much, and I'll see you on Thursday.